the Dr. Alyssa Olenick in the house. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, hello. I'm very excited that we're finally doing this.
This has been like a years in the making conversation. But you've been a little busy.
I feel like I'm the worst to get on podcasts because you have to get me like right when I'm like, yep, I have time. And then otherwise it's like, talk to me in 6 months. So I'm glad we are finally doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have so many things I would love to ask you about. I really appreciate your perspective on things. Obviously, you have the expertise and the background in so many of the sciencey things that we'll talk about here today on the podcast. And I really appreciate your perspective on things. You're so contextual, you're so nuanced, and you truly are like living in that messy middle in terms of your messaging. If the listeners haven't heard about you or heard from you yet, how did you get to the point that you are right now in your career? What are you studying? Why is it lighting you up? And kind of give us the superhero origin story.
Yeah, I'll try to keep this concise because I'm sure I'll rant longer on other things in a little bit here. But long story short, if you guys don't know who I am, I'm Dr. Alyssa Olenick, or just Doc Lyss Fitness, known in the fitness bureau. You can just call me Alyssa or Lyss. Either one works. People are always like, what do we call you? I'm like, really, as long as you're not calling me an a-hole, I don't really care. So you can call me whatever you want, refer to me whatever you like. But I have a PhD in exercise physiology. I just graduated last spring, so I'm still kind of a baby PhD, but we're out here in the trenches doing the work now. And I pretty much grew up an athlete. I always loved fitness and movement. The story goes, I fell into running on my back roads when I was like 13, 14 years old, when I just was running because in my logical teenage head, it was, if I run more, I'll get more fit and I'll be better at sports. And I just found lacrosse, and I was so excited to find a sport like late in life. I felt like I was late to sports, which is so funny because everyone had like soccer and basketball, and I cheered and danced, but I never really loved that in the same way that I ended up loving lacrosse. And I got into running more and did some cross country and track in high school. And I just remember having this overwhelming feeling of like, I want to spend my entire life learning about this and sharing this with others, because I found that movement was so magical and it made me feel so human and so alive. And it was so powerful that I was like, I wanted to share that with anyone that would listen. And of course, you learn a lot of things about resistance to exercise and barriers and like all of the things that make it so it's hard for people to move and be active or love exercise like I did along the way. But in my innocent, naive brain, I was like, I'm in this for life. So, I went to college for health and exercise science, essentially, played lacrosse for a few years. As the story goes, I had the highest GPA and the lowest playing time. So I quit because I knew I wanted to go to grad school to really focus on school. I was essentially the team tutor for the next 2 years after that, though. And so from there, I found research, and my junior year on, I was like, oh my God, you can get grad school paid for. And I become a doctor of exercise, like a dream come true. I went into college being like, oh, I want to be like an elite Nike personal trainer, not knowing that these research and science and opportunities, were there for me. And I kind of accidentally found out I was really good at school. I wasn't a bad student in high school, but I definitely wasn't like trying to be the top of my class or anything like that. I mean, I still was like an honor student. I was, but I just didn't care the same way I did in college and grad school. And I just saw all these opportunities that I just like didn't really know existed at the time. And I just dove head first right in. So I got my master's degree in exercise physiology. And that's where I kind of found female physiology research, kind of just not even intentionally. It's funny, I didn't really know about the gaps in this field or anything like that. I just knew I really liked metabolism and metabolic health, and I was really interested in research related to that. And my mentors and my masters were women, and they were doing pregnancy research, and I ended up doing metabolism research in women and helping out with some of that. And not really knowing about all this stuff, I was just like, oh yeah, this is very interesting to me. And I kind of carried that with me to my PhD, and that's where I learned about a lot of the sex differences and all that stuff. So I started to dive into like sex differences, menstrual cycle, birth control effects of exercise and metabolism in performance and women specifically. And, now I'm doing a postdoc looking at menopause and metabolism. And throughout the course of all of this, I feel like who I am as a person really doesn't matter outside the context. And during all of this, I'm competing in powerlifting meets, running ultra marathons, hiking mountains, taking a million outdoors trips and road trips, big outdoors junkie, really pursuing and experimenting my own fitness goals, and then starting up my business alongside of that, kind of merging together my love of both science and practical application in a way to give people what I wish I had when I was growing up as an athlete or individual, trying to figure out that quote unquote, like running, lifting balance that I really like to do in my training, but then also what we need to support us as female athletes and trainees, and kind of just, trying to find a way to bring all the things that I really love out of the multiple parts of my career and fitness together into one thing. And so now I'm a jack of all trades, master of a few. I don't think I get to say master of none anymore. I think I get to say a master of a few of them. And that's kind of the condensed story of how I've become who I am and what I'm doing. I've just had a really overwhelming love for learning, teaching, and movement my entire life. I think I always wanted to be like a teacher of some sort. And so I love taking the knowledge that I have and sharing that with others, but also giving them the gift that I really feel like I found at an early age in a way that actually can really, truly, I believe, transform their life through movement. And I'm very passionate about that. And I think, good education and good training can make all the difference in people's health and life. And so that's kind of just been my philosophy the whole way through. And then just a lot of effing around and finding out along the way to get to this point of like, hey, like, that's the scientific method after all. So that's kind of how I've got here, and I'm doing all the things that I'm doing.
I love that. You can also swear on this podcast. So if you want to let it rip, you
can. I never know. I'm like, hey, sometimes it adds that emphasis, that oomph, right? Like I'm fucking around and finding out.
I really appreciate that about you as, a former teacher myself, as a lifelong athlete and a science lover and science nerd. I super appreciate not only your focus on the research and the conduction. Is that a word? The conduction of the research, when you're actually in the lab doing research and bringing what you've learned and bringing, analyses of other studies to the public. I think that's incredible. I also appreciate that you are yourself an athlete. And I know, across the internet, we all define athlete in a different way, but there's something about that practical experience and that coaching experience and working with people that you cannot, you just can't synthesize, because you mentioned earlier, barriers to exercise, barriers, mindset issues, things that come up with people that prevent them from staying active. So I super appreciate that about you. Tell us about the Invisible Sportswoman study, and how has that changed the fitness industry, or at least the way some of us approach what we know about women, physiology and women, and exercise?
Yeah. So if you guys are unfamiliar with me and a group of like what I call us like our young female scientist crew. So it's me, Kelly McNulty, Emma Cowley, and Sam Moore. All we're PhD students now, PhD students and postdocs, started this thing. So me and Emma started it, and we brought in Kelly and then Sam in the second version, looking at essentially the sex gaps in exercise and sports science research. So there was a paper that did this going up to 2014. And what we did is then we pulled out the data from the 5 top sports medicine journals from 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20, I believe, the next 5 or 6 years. And we looked at, of these top 5 journals, how many of the participants were male, how many were female, and like what percentage of total participants were male versus female, and then what percentage of studies were being done on male specific stuff, female specific stuff, or just like general stuff. And essentially what we found is that now I'm going to misquote my own paper here, but it's like, I think it was 6% or 11%, somewhere between like 6 to 10%. Oh, I just presented on this, but I have so many data numbers stuck in my head from that. I think it was like 6% of total studies were done on just female specific questions and issues. And it's like 34 to 36% of total participants were females across the board. And so largely we're looking at a lot of male participants in studies. Now, there wasn't a ton of like male only specific problems being studied in this field either, but males are largely the bulk of the participants in exercise science research. So I will say, my disclaimer on this, I feel like people use this factoid or this paper a lot as a way to support poor training practices, principles, or make women feel like they're left out of science. I can't actually tell you how many times before I got off TikTok, people would like use my own paper against me when I was sharing information. They were like, yeah, but only like 6% of paper, this, and that. And I'm like, yeah, I'm the second author on that paper, and that's not what this means. So let's not weaponize this data, because what I really think is important to reflect is that we need better data. We need higher quality data, better methods. There's a million papers claiming that right now and coming out with that call to action, but we don't have no data. I think people think that, like, I hate this perception that, oh, there's no data on women. It's everything in sport and exercise science is done on men. Women are entirely left out. And that isn't true. There is a lot of research that is done on females or women across the sports science field. It's just like, there's just not a lot in like specific concentrated areas. And the problem and what makes it really hard is when we think about sports science, especially in the States, a big issue is a lot of the funding doesn't go to sports performance or science research. It's going to health, like disease, that kind of stuff. And there's a big call at the NIH to, bring out more studies, higher quality studies, things like that. So we absolutely need more and better research, but we don't have no research. Like that's important. Like I tell you, I combed through, we did a second version of this where we were kind of trying to unpack, okay, where is this gap starting from? Like, is it coming from the like first or last author? Like we looked if they were male or female, the editorial boards, study quality, surprise, surprise, when women are leading the work, the study is higher quality. There was relationships between that. And so now we're working on a version 3 right now of like, okay, well, women are leaving academia more often. These are the ones leading the research. These are the ones doing the higher quality research. Why are they leaving? Where is this gap coming from? Not just because it's easy to say, okay, there's not work being done on this. Ho hum, let's use it to, drive our crappy misinformation spreading versus like, hey, but why is this happening? And where can we fix this? And how do we address this kind of thing? Because it's bigger than just, oh, women are being left out of studies. Well, there's a lot of barriers to doing that research, that a lot of that might just be misinformation being spread to researchers, or just, I think, sometimes lazy research practices. But two, the whole like, okay, well, you have to make it perfect and better and include this also makes it like harder for researchers to then include this into the studies, and having barriers like added on top of this to begin with. So all that to say, yes, we have big gaps in sports science that I absolutely think we need to fill. We need higher quality work, but we don't have no work, and we should still be using the data that we do have to make the best application for things. But I'm super excited about this little team that we have together, putting these papers together, because we just also got a report accepted. Kelly McNulty, who leads the page period of the period, puts a lot of great female information out there as well. Kind of this call to action of menopausal women in sports science being really left out. On our second wave of this publication, we really found like maybe a handful of papers on this. So just kind of bringing more attention to the fact that yes, menstrual cycle and that kind of stuff, and like premenopausal females do need more, better research, but we have these gaps in other places too as well that can be addressed in sports science. And so I think it's really important. I do think our field will hopefully improve the next few years, especially with, as much as we can hate the trends of the misinformation around cyclic training or female stuff, it does spark researchers potentially to want to answer more of those questions. And so while our paper and the one before us really found no difference in the rate of publications on female specific stuff since I think like 2009, 2010, which is disheartening, I do hopefully think it's going to get better, especially with the NIH calls to action and more funding going towards female specific things. But I want to give people also give grace to scientists and researchers. This stuff is hard and it takes a lot of time, and try not to be so critical of science and research unless you really understand what it takes to do science and research. Because I think a lot of people use our paper as a way to for negative agenda use. And I'm like, but that's not the point. The point is to bring attention to something, call to action. How do we solve it? How do we make it better? And what does this mean? Not, okay, well, you've been left out, so let me tell you how to do X, Y, and Z based off my hypothesis, or being mad and shaming researchers because your perception doesn't match their data and not understanding what that actually means. And that's something that really has bothered me in response to that. But anyway, that's a really long-winded way of explaining Invisible Sportswoman, but also my when people hear that, I think that they want me to be all rah, women are being left out. And I absolutely am all about that. But I'm like, but what does this actually mean for our field? And how do we actually interpret this? And then how do we make it better from here?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate your insight on that as somebody who is so involved in putting that study together and looking at all of this, and also somebody who's out there doing the research. And I don't think that the general public understands what it takes to design a study, to carry it out, to do all the analysis.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, and maybe this will segue into our next topic that I would love to hear your thoughts on. There is this zest, I feel like, to understand now how women's specific differences or sex differences play out in terms of performance nutrition, in terms of strength training, in terms of cardiovascular fitness. To what degree do you feel like that zest for sort of like, hey, we matter, right? We want to understand ourselves. We want to see how we can do better with our own training, with our own nutrition. To what degree do you think that zest for understanding more has turned into a bit of a, I don't know how we would call this on social media, for example, the misinterpretation of science to drive toward a specific, well, like you said, cyclical training. We should train differently in every week of our cycle across the board. You're missing out unless you're doing this. So to what degree do you feel like that quest to understand ourselves has played into the misapplication or the misinterpretation of the data?
Yeah. So I've thought about this a lot with the popularity of all of this and the backlash I get for speaking out against the popularity for this and just kind of, it's just been interesting to see it from both sides, from research to here. And I find it interesting too, because I kind of started my dissertation stuff before this was trendy. And I went into my dissertation stuff thinking I would find these big, robust differences, and the menstrual cycle had this huge effect. And oh my God, why isn't anyone looking at this? And then I got into the data and I was like, oh, okay, not so interesting after all. Again, I'm still glad I did this work. I think it's super important, but I think it's this mix of like, I think people are wrongly accusing sports scientists for ignoring them and leaving them out. Don't get me wrong, sports science can do better, but I think a lot of the issues that has made space for cyclic training or cycle syncing or the hormone gurus to kind of take this wave and lead that they have is just the fitness industry's marketing and targeting of women for years and years and years. And so I made a thread about this like a few months ago where I was like, stop blaming sports science for what was the fitness industry's messaging towards females. And there's just been this push of, restriction and over exercising and emphasis on cardio and restricting your calories and exercising for fat loss and doing X, Y, and Z so that you can be X, Y, and Z for years and years. And what we've done is we've conditioned people to completely ignore, their own perception of their intensity of their training or their own perception of how they feel, their own recovery needs. And they're just doing these types of training and these poorly fueled, whether that's, and I think people think when I say poorly fueled, they're like, well, some people overeat. I'm like, but haphazard eating is also poor fueling. It doesn't matter even if it's over or under calories. If you're like haphazard eating, that could be a whole other topic, but like, just bear with me that I know some people in America or all across the world are overeating, but that doesn't mean it's still not supporting your training, so to speak. So anyway, I think there's this perfect storm of this neglect to what actually we need and how we need to train, which, shocker, it's probably just the marketing that was given towards males for years and years. And so then they swung in with this rise of, okay, well, I want to understand my body, which I think is incredible. I don't want people to think that I'm against this. I'm all about this. Like, hey, we actually don't know anything about our cycles or our hormones and how these impact me. And like, maybe there's a reason I feel crummy here and better here and X, Y, and Z. Or maybe there's things that I can do to help support my health and hormonal health and all these things better. And so I think there's this perfect storm of nobody talking about that because it was so taboo societally, but also I'm going to call you in here. A lot of you aren't talking about it either. And then you're getting mad that nobody's talking about it. So people aren't having community around these conversations or these things or seeking support. And so they feel alone within this. And then this wave of coaches comes in with these perfect solutions to their problems that do indirectly solve that problem, right? If you have low energy availability and you're restricting food and you're over exercising and you take on a cyclic training routine where you're doing like lower volume across the month and maybe then eating more or creating more energy availability because that, guess what? You're going to probably feel less like trash. If you're polarizing or periodizing your training even a little bit more than just going all out every single day of the week, guess what? You're probably going to be feeling a little better. But those things are coming from proper training principles, not this like magical luteal phase workout. Like I see these people all the time, they're like, oh, I need a luteal phase workout. I was like, what do you mean there's a freaking luteal phase workout? Like that's not even a thing. And if you ask 7 different hormone coaches, they're going to tell you 7 different things. And because there's no definition of that in the data, it's 100% up for interpretation. And so much of this stuff then is coming from hypothesis. And my issue with a lot of this is it's people who have a recreational interest in hormones or have some knowledge or background in training in hormones, but they don't have it in exercise science or sports science or any sort of strength and conditioning background. So they're over extrapolating hypothesis of hormone stuff that we don't have actual data on. And then assuming it's going to be X, Y, and Z. So you should do this, this, and this. And that's and it's this perfect storm of people who they either have a lot of PMS symptoms, they feel terrible, their training routines are probably pretty bad and they need better training routines and they're looking for a solution. And then they just repackage it up in the same marketing that we had in the early to mid like maybe the last like 10, 15 years ago of like, well, do this, this, and this, because if not, you'll get fat. If not, you'll gain weight. If not, you'll get the belly. So they're still using the same marketing that they're mad was being used for this, but they're doing it in a way that makes it seem like empowerment. But what they're doing is just getting people to train less, be sedentary a large fraction of the month. And I think there's like, I think it could have been really good. I think the New York Times article was great. It had this title that said cycle syncing will not save female fitness. And I loved that title because it was like, that isn't actually the solution we think it is for what we actually need here. And so I think it was just, to answer your question, I think it just was this perfect storm of people feeling left out, people ignoring their bodies, and people wanting to feel better. And then, you know, a lot of females are unhappy with their body, whether we right, wrong, or indifferent. I know our message is all like, be strong and empowered, but that doesn't change the reality that you can harp on that all day long and people are still insecure about X, Y, and Z in their bodies. So they're wanting these solutions to this. And, you know, there's already these barriers to exercise. And it is a thing. It does feel a little bit easier to have to say, okay, well, you can just be gentle and this and that feels good. And I think, you know, it's because we've left out of this conversation for so many years of you've always had permission to listen to your body. You've always had permission to adjust intensity based off perception. You've always had permission to take a rest day if you feel like hot, flaming raccoon trash can garbage. And you've always had permission to fuel yourself appropriately to support your training. So these are all, you don't need these fancy cyclic hormone made up protocols that are different from every single person that gives you one to do these things. It's just needing to adapt proper training. And so then people are like, well, you're just telling us to train like a man, or you're just promoting us to train like a man. And I was like, but all these people are doing is pinkifying protein and pinkifying creatine and pinkifying lifting weights. All they're doing is the same thing that you get mad that pads and shampoo and tampon companies are doing, but to your fitness for the same exact thing and making you feel like it's fancier than it is. And so anyway, I just think it's so multifactorial of why this happened and this perfect storm came from it. And I think that there needs to be a conversation of like, hey, let's talk about what's going on with our cycles, and let's talk about what's happening in our bodies, and let's talk about how you might perceive that and how that may impact how you feel and what that actually means for your training and how that actually compares to, you know, different phases of your cycle. But then when we think about the sex differences thing, it's like, people don't want to hear the fact that like a lot of the things that you need to be doing are exactly the same. But I think where the data and research is going to go is, okay, well, you might need less rest times, or you might need higher weights at the same relative intensity because of different like neuromuscular recruitment and things like that. That's where the sex differences are, not you're a delicate little flower who can't handle cortisol. You're going to implode into a pile of fat. Let's just swaddle you in a blanket and not move for 30 days. Like that's patronizing, and it's not helping us. And like, females are meeting the physical activity guidelines significantly less, especially through the 30s and 40s than their male counterparts. So how do we actually get women or females across a lifespan to train in a way that supports them and gives them the skills to work with that? And I think, again, you know, we don't have a lot of sports scientists doing this because they're doing the work, or they need to be doing more of that work in lab. I agree 100%. But we just don't have the coaches in the popular viral aspects of the industry spreading these tools or information at these populations who are then vulnerable to this marketing. So that's my high horse on that. But yeah, I think it's a lot of things. I think it's a lot of things coming together at once.
Yeah, that would be my perception on it as well. Is it's kind of this layering effect. It's kind of this brewing or perfect storm of factors that comes together. I even saw not too long ago on social media, somebody saying, you know, you should eat twice as much protein in your luteal phase as in your follicular phase. And I was like, I mean, is there a grain of truth? And I would be interested to hear, you know, you share for the listeners, like, what are some of the things that we see maybe fueling wise, as you mentioned, energy availability and things like that.
Yeah.
But, you know, sort of where do some of the sex differences come in terms of maybe nutrition and what we know so far about the menstrual cycle? And secondarily, you know, how do we then take that information and use it to inform our practice?
Yeah. So when we think about males versus females as a whole, sex differences are probably more apparent than actually like menstrual cycle differences. And so I think when people, there's two things that we're questioning and asking here. And I think a lot of people think when you say there's no menstrual cycle differences, they're saying you're just a man. Psh, ignore you. And I'm like, there's a difference between sex differences and menstrual cycle differences. Those are completely two different things that we are talking about here. When we're thinking about males versus females, at the end of the day, for the most part, we all need very, very similar things. What it's going to come down to is males are more glycolytic. They're more carbohydrate burning and reliant as a whole. They have more type 2 muscle fibers. Women are a little bit better at using and burning fat for fuel. They're a little bit less glycolytic, so they're not as like carb dependent. They have potentially more type 1 muscle fibers, things like that. Men are bigger, faster, stronger, more powerful, just due to the higher testosterone levels and how that contributes to muscle recruitment and development differences. There's a really great review paper that just came out from the American College of Sports Medicine that actually goes through all the differences between male and females. I'm pretty sure it's public access. I really encourage people to read that. It's pretty dense, but if you really want to understand the sex differences here, but at the end of the day, women, and like everyone's like, okay, well, women aren't men, so we shouldn't train like men. I'm like, yeah, but we're human beings, right? We're going to respond. And we have data that shows if you train women, if you give them resistance training, if you give them cardiovascular training, they adapt to that training. They're not adapting to that. It's a stressor and a stimulus, and we're responding to it, right? So it's not like we need these different things. So that's where I think people get really lost in the sauce. And so the one big thing though, that is more prominent is, especially in females, is that we are more sensitive to energy deficits. So that's not just across the day or week as like a caloric deficit or an overall energy deficit, but also across our days. And we have a whole group of millennial females who think it's super trendy and cheeky to live off an iced coffee and a whiff of air all day long. And then they're like, my hormones are wrecked and my fitness isn't working. And we're like, well, let's actually, like, instead of prying on that as this cortisol dysregulation of causing all your fat imbalance, and you need to, change your exercise routine entirely, maybe we just like eat some breakfast. You know what I mean? Like maybe we actually feed ourselves before 2 p.m. kind of stuff. Like those are things we need to be talking about and thinking about. And so we are more sensitive to these energy deficits, which means that if we are in too much of an energy deficit, whether that's across the day, across our exercise training sessions, across our month, our week, or training, whatever it is, over time, that can downregulate our hormones. That can suppress hormones, that can suppress ovulation. You can eventually lose your menstrual cycle. You can then have declines in muscle or bone because of that loss of cycle or that loss of, the decline in hormones, right? And I think this is something that's left out of this conversation, is that is more stressful on your body than any workout in your luteal phase or menstrual phase are going to be. When we look at it, the inflammatory response, the stress response and performance declines of people who have anovulation or lost menstrual cycles are more significant, more meaningful, and more apparent than what we see, like if there's any differences at all across the menstrual cycle. Like that is so much more apparent. And similarly, when we look at some of the performance data or metabolism data, when we look at cycle phases, when we talk about just like what's the differences between our cycle phases, a lot of those go away when someone's fed. So yes, you might see some of these differences, but when you feed people, a lot of that goes away. Performance is restored, or metabolism differences are completely they go away entirely. And so that, and also when you work at high intensities or short outputs, there's those differences kind of also go away. And that, especially with aerobic metabolism, and there might be some things that are different there, and we can get that in a second. But when we're thinking about these big differences, the biggest thing is that, you probably just need to eat frequently and enough and adequately, including enough protein. So to speak to your protein thing, is like, there's a grain of small truth in all of these things. And I feel like the problem with having my brain be wired the way it is I can just I want people to have that skill of extracting and seeing that nuance of something. So it's like, I think I made a reel recently. It was like, is it cycle syncing that worked, or did they just have low energy availability, right? Because once you start eating more and feeling better, you're going to have all these things improve, right? Your body functions better fed. But to the protein thing, there is a little bit of data to suggest there might be greater protein oxidation or breakdown, or the progesterone levels in the luteal phase might be slightly more catabolic. So you might need more protein. But this accounts to 5 to 10% increase a day. So yes, you technically can eat more protein during this phase, but if you're eating a moderate to high protein diet across the month, then it probably doesn't really matter. So yes, bump up a little bit if you're somebody who's low on protein on average. My usually advice or recommendation is have amino acids in your bloodstream before you work out. As in always, I think that's good advice always, but in this phase, it might be more advantageous to hey, let's get a pre-workout shake in prior. I'm very pro pre-workout shakes or pre-workout amino acid feedings. Everyone's post-workout. I'm no, let's get it in beforehand. But that's the difference is like very minuscule and small. So there is a grain of truth there, right? So we do potentially need more protein. We might crave more food across the cycle in general. Those are valid. You might have slight increases in metabolism, but again, that's like 2 to 12%, which accounts for a very small number of calories a day. It hasn't even that data hasn't been confirmed in active population. So it's like, yes, you probably might need a little bit more, but it's like 80 to like maybe some of the upper end of the studies are like 270 calories, but we're talking like a snack, not a full extra meal type thing. And so that's where you see these small grains of truth, but then they lose the context of what they actually mean. So it's like, yeah, you do need more protein, but if you're eating high protein to begin with, then you probably don't need to change anything at all, right? If you're underfed and you feel like crap, maybe try having some more carbs or a good meal before your training session and see how that helps or how that feels and how that recovery goes in response to that. And so there's these small grains of truth across the board. But when we're thinking about like what we actually need training wise, this is, again, is not me being anti-female by any means, but you don't need radically different things. We see this with cycle training and pregnancy and menopause and this repackaged pinkified version of training that is literally the same thing that you probably have college boy football players doing, but in a nice, pretty pink, this is safe for you and good for you package kind of thing. What the message should be is, and what I think a lot of people are trying to do is, hey, you've been neglecting strength training for a really long period of time. We should be doing this. Hey, this is important too for X, Y, and Z. Hey, actually, instead of burning your body into the ground with endless cardio and restriction, let's build muscle tissue because that will actually give you this the body structure and shape that you are looking for. But then that has reverse turned into like cardio is bad, cardio is the devil, cardio is making you fat, cardio is pointless. And so we see this hyper swing where now we're having people saying, well, cardio isn't good for women to do. And we're like, no, that is not, that's not the point. And so it's just what we need is to combat that marketing towards females, but also making them realize that a lot of the stuff that we do have in sports science that has been done on both males and females or females in general does work for them. They don't need these really different training programs. And there's a small degree of truth in most information that is out there that seems confusing and you don't know what to believe. But usually there's a more detailed, better explanation that, trust me, I know is not as viral as some of these claims as what they can be, but like, what does that actually mean for you and what should you do with it rather than doubling your protein across the month, which is silly, right? Because if someone was eating 1 gram a pound per body weight a day of protein, they would not need to double it. Now, if they're eating 50 grams a day, well, in general, you should probably just double that, period, across the board. So we have to think about, what that actually means for you. But yeah, that's the biggest thing is like, we're really sensitive to energy deficits. We need to be fed. We do better fed. What that looks like for you is probably different for everyone's not at risk for anovulation and loss of cycles and being too lean. And I know that, but also you can't just starve yourself into whatever you're trying to do with your fitness and training and expect that to work. And yes, we are a little bit more fat oxidative and men are more glycolytic, but really when it comes down to it for what that means for you and your training, not much. Just make sure you're doing power, explosive strength work and some sort of high intensity work, like things that you should probably be doing already, but it just are important for you to develop if you don't have them naturally.
Amen. The mic drop.
I know. I keep rambling so much. But there's just so many layers to all of these things. And I want people to like, I feel like hearing people go through nuanced thought helps people be like, oh, I never thought about it that way.
100%. Absolutely. When you were talking about being fed and you sort of said millennial women, and I was like, this is the same thing in the population that I work with as well, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like the over reliance on fasting, and again, these are women who are trying to improve their fitness. They're trying to get in the gym and they know, yes, I do want to lift. I mean, I don't have to try too hard to say, hey, this is why it's good for us. People are wanting to lift. They're wanting to improve their cardiovascular fitness. And yet this is such an area of resistance where they're really like, yes, I am an athlete. I'm training with intention. I'm training with purpose. I want to improve. And then when we talk about not fasting and they're like, oh, I don't know, maybe, no, I'm not an athlete. Who's an athlete? So knowing that your research is in fat oxidation, I'm curious if you can give folks just a super, this is probably an oxymoron, like a super quick,
I can be both, don't worry.
Super quick explanation of why fasted training may not be as beneficial as we're sold, especially for, I would say maybe more, I was going to say vulnerable populations, but for just populations of people that are already maybe, their nutrition is a little bit chaotic. They're a little bit high stress. What do you have to say about that?
One, from what I do know about the fasting data right now, I think the data of ending your eating earlier in the night and stopping after dinner is more exciting and more promising than the morning stuff. So if you're super gung-ho on trying fasting, there is some data to suggest that there's more glucose dysregulation and like metabolism might be a little bit more not as efficient in the evening and afternoons, maybe not afternoons, but like late evening. So maybe if you're going to do that, consider just not eating after dinner. That's not saying that like eating after dark will make you fat type of thing, but if you want to fast, consider toying with that rather than not eating in the morning. So that's usually what I tell people first off. I was like, if you really want to do that, two, the issue for most of us is not that we need fasting windows. It's that we don't need to be eating for 15 hours a day. We do want to give our digestion a break. You don't need to be like in America, we eat like from the second we wake up continuously all day long. Like you just just take breaks between your meals and let yourself rest and digest. But if you're more active, you're probably going to need to eat more often. So that's where that nuance comes into play. If you're more active, like when I was training for my 50 miler, I'm pretty sure I eat every single hour of the day. Where right now my training volume's lower and I'm like just eating 3 meals a day and like maybe a protein snack and I'm fine because I know that my body's like not in this constantly like my stomach isn't being emptied like pretty much constantly used for fuel. And you can kind of feel that difference in yourself. But we just need to take breaks. You fast every single day. You fast overnight. If you're interested in fasting, that's fine. 2, if you're stressed about cortisol and you're all worried about cortisol making you fat and killing you and murdering you, guess what brings down cortisol? Carbohydrates. Guess what makes exercise in the morning or in general less stressful for you? Being fed. Your body has that response. You're going to have a catecholamine response to exercise no matter what you do, because that's how your body, it's not just cortisol. There's other adrenal things like norepinephrine and things like that are signaling your body to release glucose and triglycerides into the bloodstream to use for fuel metabolism. So if you're not fed, your body has to work harder to supply and support that training. 2, you're going to have a higher quality training session. You're going to expend more, I don't want to say energy in the sense of like quantifying exercise to calories, but you're going to have more power output, which that is a better training session. You're going to get more of a response and adaptation. Your recovery is going to be easier if you are fed and your body has nutrients going into that workout. So don't think about it as like just, oh, what do I burn in this short window? Because guess what? How much more are you going to actually get quality wise by being fed in that state? You're going to have higher quality training. You're going to have probably more adaptations and you're probably going to recover better. All things that ultimately lead to improved metabolism along the way. 2 or 3, whatever point I'm on. There's some data that shows that yes, you might oxidize more fat in that session, but oxidizing fat isn't burning like belly fat. That's not the same thing. But your body is smart and our body will kind of switch. So there's some data that supports that once you're fed, your body then will switch to like carbohydrate oxidation more throughout the day. But trust me, as somebody who's done studies of people doing exercise fasted, we did HIIT studies for all my dissertation stuff and people were fasted because it's just a way to control for any differences. And I'm telling you right now, guys, we're talking grams. We're talking grams of fat. You're still using a ton of carbs during that training. We're talking like a few grams of fat is being used. I pull up graphs of it. So yes, you are using fat during that training, but my high horse of all of the world here, besides like, hey, you're probably going to your body's going to even out across the day and your overall fat balance matters more. Do you know what burns more fat during exercise across the day in response to what you eat in general? Dun, dun, dun. Having a higher cardiovascular fitness status. People with higher cardiovascular fitness statuses are better at using fat for fuel, metabolically handling and responding to the meals that they eat, using fat during exercise so that they actually can work at a higher power output or longer or not fatigue at the same higher intensities as other people. All of these things, which are great for performance and health, they probably don't mean that much outside. Like if in a caloric balance across the day, if you're eating all things equal, it's probably not making that much of a difference. You still like have to adjust your diet appropriately if like fat loss is your goal. I know that's not necessarily a community here, but you can't talk about fat oxidation without acknowledging that like low fat balance leads to like decreased fat mass. So Anyway, that's like my thing is that I think that gets missed a lot of this is like, we're all worried about doing these small things for a few extra calories of fat burning. But the best thing that you can do is one, fuel your training. Whether you think you're an athlete or not, you want your session to give you the things that you want out of it, right? If you're getting up and doing like a yoga session or like maybe just like a really light resistance training thing that's like an upper body pump, you can probably get away with just eating afterwards. But if you're doing anything of substance, you probably want something in your system. And I would worry more about improving the work that you do in your training sessions or your cardio sessions or your lifting sessions than, oh, was it fasted or not kind of thing. And so that, I just think it misses the forest for the trees. I know why it's trendy. I know it came from the bodybuilding world, but like those are the things that I think people should really consider when doing this. And I'm just going to cut to it because I know that people are going to be like, but what if I can't eat in the morning? It's impossible. One, you can train your gut. Trust me, my PhD destroyed my gut inside out. I had so many GI issues. I worked with Dr. Adrian Chavez for a year and I'm so much better now. And I have to eat in the mornings because especially with my cardio and my running and my training, I had to figure out how to do all that. I had to retrain my gut because I was living off coffee and a wish doing these testing sessions in my PhD. I was getting up at like 3:30, 4 in the morning, drinking coffee, going to lab, running these sessions, and it destroyed me. But I learned how to eat in the mornings. And even before training sessions, you don't need to eat a full meal and rest. I know a lot of people are like, I'm getting up at 5 a.m. and I'm working out. Like we're talking like if I have to get out the door and get a training session in, we're talking eating an applesauce packet or two. I'll do a couple graham crackers, a cup of chocolate milk, half a protein shake, like with some milk that has like any sort of alternative milk or regular milk has sugar or carbs in it. It doesn't need to be heavy. At least, I mean, if you can get something protein in, great. But if not, getting at least some carbs in that are easy digesting is important, or eat them during your training. Like take in intracarbohydrates during that training. If you're having to go fast in the morning, that can be like a sports drink solution in your drink, or you can bring snacks with you during that training so that you have some fuel for yourself, through that and across that. So it doesn't need to be like, sit down and have a 4-course breakfast, digest, and then go do your training all before 6 a.m. Like it can just be little tiny bits, just enough. Like think 30 to 50 grams of carbs is probably a good place to aim for. And that's like 2 applesauce packets. Like it's not a 4-course meal. So that wasn't as quick as I thought it would be, but I just was like, I know someone's going to want to know this, and I know somebody's going to ask about this, and I know someone's going to feel frustrated about this. So let's just get the whole gamut.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's this perception that you had to sit down and eat one of those hungry man Denny's breakfasts or something. And, you're just going to be super weighed down, but it's something that I feel like if people can just start where they need to be, start small, figure out what works for them. Obviously if you're running or things like that, I mean, you might have a little bit more sloshing, so you kind of have to figure that out. But to your point, I've never met, now some people prove me wrong and write into me, but I've never met anybody who introduced a little bit of pre-workout fueling and was like, gosh, I felt so much worse. I performed way worse. It was a disaster. So
some people will say that they feel worse, but I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you guys a tip. Time it where you're either eating it more than 30 minutes before or less than 10 minutes. Because if you're feeling crummy, odds are what's happening is that you're eating in that like 10 to 30 minute window where you're then having an insulin response. And then when you start exercising, your muscles send little glucose cells up to the wall to take in that. So you're kind of having like 2 times as much of that glucose being pulled out. So then you kind of bonk and you get hypoglycemic. So time it where you're doing it like, okay, if you get up at 5 and you're training by 5:30, like have it as soon as you wake up, or literally have it when you're walking into the gym or on the way. Like when I was in my PhD and I used to train at 6 a.m, I would just drink a glass of chocolate milk while I was driving over to the gym. Because lifting, you don't feel that GI upset as much as you do with other things. And then running, I'll just wait until like, I'll either eat and then wait 30 minutes, or I'll just like take a couple applesauce packets or a couple graham crackers or whatever, like right before I'm ready to kind of to head out the door. So that's the only time that I think they end up accidentally feeling like crap with their training, is they like eat that at that weird timing where they like bonk unintentionally, but it's not the fueling. It's just your body just was really trying to take up the carbs.
Absolutely. Do you have time for one more question?
I have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
You're good. You're totally fine. I have time.
I'm just like, I have so much I want to ask.
No, you're good.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground, and I feel like we've been inching toward this topic as this podcast has gone on. And I know that you have been you have been somebody out there, not only from the training point of view, but personally in your own training, banging on the drum of cardiovascular fitness and why this is so important. And there's this interesting thing happening right now in our industry, in the fitness industry, which is zone 2 cardio is having this renaissance. I don't know. I mean, I used to race mountain bikes.
Yeah.
I started racing mountain bikes in 2003. Hearing about building an aerobic base is not a new concept, yet it has risen in popularity for some reason this year. It's on everybody's lips. There's a lot of, I'm sure, misunderstanding about it. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of frustration about building your cardiovascular fitness.
Yeah.
So for the folks listening, I guess maybe an interesting place to begin would be when we're looking at improving our cardiovascular fitness, where do we need to start? If somebody has not done any cardio, because I know we were saying earlier, if we look back at the data, women especially are not meeting, we're not doing the best job at meeting our cardiovascular minimums. When we add strength training onto it, then that number goes down. But how do we get people to begin knowing that the industry has made this really complex, and then people feel frustrated about getting started?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say, for those of you who are unfamiliar with me or my content, I did just publish this week a video on like how to make zone 2 easier. And I have a video that breaks down all of the zones, and I have like a whole ebook on this kind of stuff. And so if you like, I'm going to give a quick version of this here, but there is like, I do have some more in-depth things. And I think I have a couple podcasts coming out in the new year of like what counts as cardio, and then how do you know your cardio is working? Cause I know this is like a hot topic for people, and trust me, if you follow me, I feel your frustration. Everyone yells at me because cardio is hard. And I'm like, I know it's hard. I'm a beefcake by nature. My genes aren't made for running, but I do it anyway. But that being said, I think that the first thing first is you just need to get yourself to the physical activity guidelines. Do not worry about the mode or how you do it or how intense it is or the zone that you're in. The first thing you need to do is get to the physical activity guidelines, which are 150 minutes of moderate to physical activity a week, or 75 minutes of vigorous. And it's essentially a 2-for-1 trade-off. So you can work 50% less for when it's more intense kind of thing. And so you want to distribute this across the week. And this is a lot. This is a lot. Like 150 minutes is like 2.5 hours of cardio a week. And people are like, what? That's crazy kind of thing. And so I think it's important to recognize, and this is like the conversation that happens too, is like for many of you just getting started, a brisk walk will count towards that. But as you get fitter, a brisk walk doesn't count towards that. So that's where it's tricky, because people will be like, Alyssa, if I can't walk and this and that, how I get this in? To that, I say, get off the industry high horse of if you don't get 10 to 15,000 steps a day, you're going to crumble. I would rather, this is a qualm I have with a lot of coaches who make it seem like if you don't get 10,000 steps a day and you're going to crumble. And I'm like, that's like 3 to 4 miles of walking a day. And that's like at least an hour of walking a day. Now, granted, it's broken up, things like that, but I would rather somebody get 6,000 or 7,000 steps a day in and trade that time, even if it's 15 or 20 minutes, towards more formal cardio. And you can position that before or after your training session. A lot of people worry about doing cardio before they're lifting. If you're doing 10 or 15 minutes of cardio before you're lifting, you're probably not having the interference effect that you think it is, or do it after. If you're doing higher heart intensity, more volume stuff, I prefer to do it after or on its own, but just get it in where you can to start. Again, your walking needs to be vigorous. Like your breath is increasing. It's not just a passive, casual, regular walk. Like your heart rate should be at least in the hundreds when this is happening. The rate of it will depend, of course, on your age and your fitness level. But if you're in a walk and your heart rate's under 100 beats per minute, it's probably not intense enough for any adaptation, but that movement is still good. But anyway, you can do this moderate activity, which is probably getting your heart rate to at least above 50%, maybe ideally 60% of your heart rate max for 150 minutes per week. And this can be done anyway. People are like, I think the industry does a really poor job of making people that they have to do cardio, like they have to run or they have to bike or they have to do X, Y, and Z. It doesn't matter how you're doing it. It can be any sort of cardio: row, swim, bike, dance, hike, rock, whatever it is. I know you've really been rocking a lot recently too. Just do whatever you need to do. Make sure your ventilation's increasing, your heart rate's getting up. It feels a little bit exertional across the week. If you cannot get to 150 minutes per week, you don't need, like off the bat, Start where you're at. Start with 20 minutes twice a week and do that until that feels sustainable, and then add. And so this is where it's nice with the alternative of 75 minutes of vigorous activity, which is about an hour and 15 minutes of harder intensity work a week, where you can just do a few HIIT sessions or a few harder intensity runs or a few harder intensity cardio things to get to that. And it takes half as much time. If you're meeting those guidelines, I don't really care how you're getting there. The nuance and the fanciness and all that stuff doesn't really matter. That is like the minimal standard of what we've kind of deemed like this is what you need for health and longevity. Same with the 2 full body resistance training days a week, which that can be a lot for people. If we're thinking like 1 to 2 hours of lifting for a week and 2.5 hours of cardio, that can feel like a lot for a lot of people. Start where you're at, meet yourself with where you're at. Everything counts and adds up. I think a lot of people do a bad job of making people feel like they're not, like it's all or nothing kind of thing. And it's absolutely not. Everything you do matters. The biggest thing is you want whatever you're doing, you want it to be improving your fitness. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but that's why intensity is great, because you can get more adaptations with less. There's a lot of stuff with exercise snacks. If you do a few all out sprinting or really hard stair climbs per day across the day, that you can still get some of these benefits, even though it's in smaller microdoses. So meet yourself where you're at to the physical guidelines. Once we get past the physical activity guidelines, where I'm kind of like, I don't really care what you're doing if you're doing less than this a week, because it's like, you just need to be doing it, right? And you need to be doing it consistently enough for things to adapt. Because here's the deal. If you're not doing a lot of cardio right now, or you have a really poor aerobic base or poor cardiovascular fitness, you don't have a zone 2, period. You do have a zone 2, but like everything you do is going to spike your heart rate. It's going to be hard. You just don't have the cardiovascular fitness. And so I like to tell people all the time, you're not fit enough to worry about that, for a lot of things that people tend to get hyper focused on. So like in my running programs, for like a lot, like my first 3 or 4 programs people do as beginners, we just use RPE, because it's just, your heart rate's going to be high because you just don't have the fitness to do that. So it's like, if you're trying to like run or gain a skill or fitness, just focus on doing that. And then as you develop that, let's worry about that nitty gritty. This isn't me saying zone 2 isn't important or zone 4 isn't important, or these different polarizations or pyramidal approaches are useless. No, I use them in my programming and I preach them. I same with you. Like I wrote my ebook Endure in 2018. And for years people are like, yeah, I'll slow down. Okay, run easy. This is great. And now people are like, well, my heart rate was this 1 beat per minute in my zone 3 for 1 minute. And am I going to die and am I going to explode? Is this correct? Oh my gosh, I can't get out of zone 4 and I'm freaking out, but I'm in the beginner program. And I'm like, stop. Like this has made it for people just more barriers to this. So first get to that. Then we can start thinking about, okay, the zone 2 thing. Zone 2 is great. Zone 2 is fantastic for building like an aerobic base and cardiovascular fitness, and contributes to health uniquely, but similarly to high intensity exercise. Ideally, we want both in our training programs or week. We want a mix of both. And so the more volume you're doing, so the more minutes per week that you're doing, the more you're going to want to split up this intensity into doing, okay, something like maybe 60, 70, 80, 90% of your training is easy. And then 10, 20, 30, 40% of whatever it is high and hard intense. And that distribution is going to depend on how much you're doing. So when I was training for my 50 miler, I was running like 9 to 11 hours a week. That's a lot of minutes per week. I cannot do 10 hours of running per week in my zone 4, or I'm never going to recover. I'm going to feel horrific. That's going to be just a recipe for disaster. So then I was having like one harder quality session a week, and the rest was very easy and slow. So I probably had something like 10 to 20% of my training was in zone 3 to 4 during that. Zone 3 is also not the devil if you use it for intentional things, right? I'm training for an ultra marathon. You're not doing zone 5 and ultra, trust me. A lot of zone 2 and 3, but right now I'm in this off season. I'm in a really busy season of life. I'm probably only doing 2 hours of cardio right now in my week. Guess what? I do not care about my heart rate. I'm trying to get in, get out. I'm doing a few more HIIT sessions. I'm doing a little bit more threshold level effort in my running, and then maybe a easy running for the rest of that throughout the week. But it's not as that distribution doesn't matter as much, because you're just not doing a ton. The only caveat there is as you're adding it in, I would not encourage you all to add 3 high intensity sessions a week to get to 75 minutes right off the bat. Maybe do 1 hard and 2 easy, and then build up to that over time, or do a few easy sessions and in with some sprints or harder stuff. Like you don't want to just dive into that. But the less you're doing, the less that distribution really matters. The more volume you're doing, the more it matters, or the more specific the goals that you have are. So if you're somebody who knows you're fit and you're like, well, I can't stay in zone 2 to save my life. I just talked about this in my podcast. Like, that's where you need to have that conversation with yourself, which you've done endurance sports. You're like, oh, I should probably spend a season of time actually developing this, because it is a physiological adaptation to it. And you have to do it to get better at it. And the less fit you are, or the more new to you are, the actually like the lower the heart rate and the easier and slower you're going to have to go, because you have to gain the fitness that allows you to kind of have your zone 2 be at a higher heart rate over time. Right. And that is dependent. That's part of that fitness status leading to more fat oxidation, because a lot of that is related to fat oxidation. And that's one of the characteristics that is trained is improved mitochondrial density and quality, and some of the different physiological adaptations to cardio that happen in that zone 2 training can come with high volumes of this easy work that's recoverable, but then you get better at those things over time. So, then you get to a point where you're like, I have a specific goal, or I realize I really suck at this and I need to develop this. That's when we can start saying, okay, let's look at the distribution of your training, and let's program this efficiently and appropriately. And let's keep our hard sessions hard and our easy sessions recoverable, right? Again, hard can be zone 3, 4, 5. It doesn't have to only be zone 4 or 5. It just depends on what your goals and training are. I think people like, I definitely agree with like the gray zone of zone 3, but I also think it gets a bad rap where people think like they're going to die if they do moderate intensity exercise. And that's not the case. But you have to then decide, once you've been doing this for a while, okay, what do I actually want out of this? For most of you, I would be happy if you did whatever you needed to do to get the physical activity guidelines for the rest of your life. But if you have these specific goals, or you want to get better at specific things, or you do start caring more about endurance sports or things like that, then, okay, let's focus on this. That doesn't mean that you can say zone 2 is great. If you are new to cardio and you want to just use zone 2 biking to get started in cardio, that's fantastic. It's really easy and low accessible. But what I'm saying is, don't sit there and freak out because after 3 training sessions, your heart rate isn't lower, because that's adaptation to zone 2 training is something that's not coming in like 6, 12 weeks. Clients get so frustrated all the time because it's like, it's not working. It's not working. It's not working. We're talking, give yourself 6, 9, 12, 15 months for this stuff to happen. Your adaptations to what you need to develop this with cardiovascular fitness is painfully slow. So it might not mean you're not doing anything wrong. And that's why for beginners to cardio, I say just focus on getting fitter, because you're going to drive yourself mad trying to be in that perfect zone 2 heart rate while you're also trying to adapt to a new behavior, while you're also trying to learn how to do a new skill. Like, just focus on adding that in and gaining that skill, especially if you're under the physical activity guidelines or only getting to that point. Then we can refine later, but you're not going to die if your heart rate's spiking, and you're not going to die if you drift into zone 3, and you're not going to get no benefits or no adaptations if your heart rate is high. It's just, it depends on how much you're doing the volume, where you're at in your fitness and training, and what your goals are. Again, zone 2 is beneficial for everyone across the board. I'm not saying that just ignore it entirely, but I think that people get so like, they get so consumed. It's this all or nothing perfectionist thing applied to everything. And it's crazy to me because we have clients or people in my DMs or comments, and I'm like, I have a PhD in this and I'm not even this dogmatic about it. I'm just like, okay, we're running easy. Cool. Great. Oh, my heart is a little high today, so I should just maybe slow down. Or this feels really hard, so maybe I should take it easy. Or you know what? I'm short on time, so I'm just gonna bang this one out today and call it a day. Like you don't, it's not this such fragile thing. If you just give your body stimulus enough frequently enough, it will adapt and get better. And then you can worry about those details later on. So I know that's like a nuanced thing where I'm like, it matters and you should care, but also you don't need to really worry about it right now. Kind of like all things in fitness, right? Like these are things where it's like, yes, it's important and you can do it, but don't let that be the thing stopping you from getting started and doing what we know is good for you and will move that needle forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm of the same mindset, which is we got to get you to get your minimums first and foremost. Once somebody has kind of cracked that nut, right? And I always talk with people too. I'm like, it's not just knowing the number of minutes. It's what else has to flex around your day, right? You're probably not only just exercising in your day and that's the only thing you're doing. You're working, taking care of the household, running errands, doing other things for enjoyment. I mean, taking care of the family. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that has to move around the training as well. But once somebody has gotten to that, they're sort of like gotten into a groove and they do want to turn a little bit more attention to maybe further developing that aerobic base.
Yeah.
I know you talked about RPE a little bit. And this is where I see a lot of people kind of losing the thread. They're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what heart rate I need. And can you talk a little bit about heart rate and its sort of place in all this? Because I think people think this is the one number I need to live and die by. And how else do you help people figure out where they need to be in terms of like, it is truly an easy effort. I think that's where people get kind of lost. I have my answer, but I'd like to hear what you do with people.
Yeah. So there's two things. There's the people who are saying, well, my RPE is low and my heart rate's really high. Well, you're probably actually going harder than you think you are. So let's check that. I hear that one a lot. And I'm like, well, let's actually check what you think is hard. Cause zone 2 feels easier. It feels like you're like not exerting anything. Like, and it can be kind of boring. So I know that's why people don't like it. And so one, I think that the best way to check in with yourself is, I think there's this pushback against heart rate because people are getting so dogmatic about it. Heart rate is a valuable and practical and good tool for training. I'm very pro heart rate, but heart rate in context of everything else. What is your heart rate monitoring approach? Are you using a wrist-based monitor or a chest-based monitor? Because one, it's going to be more accurate if you're using a chest-based monitor. Two, let's use heart rate in conjunction with RPE and respiration, talking, breathing. And four, why is your heart rate maybe elevated? That's artificially elevated outside of this. That isn't just your exercise intensity. Are you dehydrated? Is it hot and humid out? Or are you underfed? Is it hour 10 of the ultra marathon? You will have some cardiac drift. Sometimes your cardiac drift is because you went out too hard and your heart couldn't sustain that. So it's drifting, or it is conditions, but when the conditions are hot and humid, you should just slow down. I know people really hate that in the summers. It just means it's more stressful and you should probably slow down, which makes it really, really crummy. And I know that. But the reason, let me explain the reason why we use heart rate. So if you were to go into the lab and you were to do a exercise test called a graded exercise test, where you gradually increase the intensity of exercise, like pretty much linearly or step by step until you couldn't go anymore. That's a VO2 max test. But similarly, there's a lactate threshold test, which does that similarly. And what you do is you have a mask on your face that's taking your respiration. So it can see how much O2 and CO2 you're breathing in and then breathing out. And then finger sticks of your blood of something called blood of lactate, which is produced as a byproduct at the end part of glycolysis, which is just how you burn or use carbs in the body when there isn't a high level of oxygen available for it to be then turned into fuel with oxygen. I'm trying not to use super big words here. Lactate's always being produced in the body and it's always being produced during exercise. But eventually when you get to high or hard enough intensity, your body starts producing this faster than it can clear it out, because it will take this lactate and go take it to other places and then turn it into like basically fuel for you to use, take it back into glucose and burn it and use it for energy metabolism. When this increases rapidly, it's called your lactate threshold. And this is kind of that tipping point of which you can't sustain intensities above this for long periods of time. So these are going to be your shorter, all out, really hard exercise intensities. So this is your lactate threshold. Similarly, around the same time that your lactate threshold starts to happen, something called your ventilatory threshold starts to happen as well. So it's this point at which your body starts producing more CO2 more rapidly than it's breathing out O2 or versus the O2 coming in. So your body is basically in a more, you can call it kind of more acidic, and it's not able to buffer itself as efficiently, and you can't sustain that exercise intensity for much longer. When we're doing this in the labs, or if you did this yourself, you would wear a heart rate monitor, and we would find the point of which your heart rate was related to that. And that's the point of which below you should probably be training when you're doing this. Most of you aren't going to labs to do this. So the reason heart rate is so popular though, is because you don't need a lactate meter. You don't need a metabolic cart. It's an easy thing that's really cheap and accessible for many people, especially with photoplethysmography is what it's called when it's wrist-based, has become more popular over the last decade. And so what you're essentially trying to indirectly do is find that point. A lot of people say 60 to 70%, and that technically isn't false. For many of you that have a lower fitness status, poor cardiovascular fitness status, you are probably going to have to exercise in your zone 2 at a lower percentage of your max heart rate because you are not fit. So that lactate threshold or that ventilatory threshold, the point at which cardiovascular exercise starts to get harder for you, that is what is shifted forward when you do cardiovascular training and you get more fit, which is also why you can burn more fat when you're more fit during exercise, or you're more efficient at it. So that shifts forward, which means the heart rate at which that happens at shifts forward. So the people out there running 2-hour marathons, for example, are running at like 85 to 90% of their VO2 max. That's how far their lactate threshold is shifted over. So that's at how intense of their absolute maximal running speed that they can handle, they can do, where their body is able to still clear lactate and use oxygen efficiently for fuel metabolism. What you're doing with training is shifting that forward. So 2-hour marathon runner zone 2 is going to be a lot higher than mine or yours if you're more sedentary or unfit, or even if you're like in the process of getting fitter. And so this is what makes it really hard for people who are new to this, is that you're going to have to, like, they're like, oh my God, this can't be real that I have to exercise at this low of a heart rate. No, it is. But as you get better at it and you do it more and you do it longer, it will shift. So something I do with my clients, or we have in my ebooks, which I keep plugging here, but that's just the system that I use, is something called a threshold test. And so what we do is we have you do this threshold test. And then I have these calculators that I share with people to use to kind of estimate for themselves, or I have like a service where I'll do it for you and kind of look at your data. And what you do is you're trying to figure out what your personal threshold is, and based off like the duration of the test you're doing. So like the calculations for this are different than like, so don't just go all out and find that heart rate, because it's going to vary if you're doing 30 minutes, 60 minutes, a half marathon, a marathon. Like it kind of depends on how long you're doing that intensity. And you kind of figure out, okay, well, what is your average heart rate when you're kind of doing this maximal sustained level effort? And then from here, how does that adjust for your heart rate? And that can be a little bit more accurate than age predicted heart rate max. But for most of you starting out, you can do age percentage heart rate max. And people are like, well, what about heart rate reserve, heart rate max? It's all going to come out within the same relative range of beats per minute. The best thing that you can probably actually do for yourself is find your true heart rate max. And you can do that by doing like a few all out sprints on like a bike or up a hill, or doing a gradual exercise, running on a treadmill where you make the incline and speed faster until you get like to the highest heart rate that you can get. If you don't know that from your own data or watch, that will be more accurate than just doing 220 minus your age. And that can help people. But otherwise, for many people, like your threshold will vary, and it's going to be like a threshold test or a threshold value is going to be more accurate though in people who are fit. Because if you're unfit, you're going to have an artificially high heart rate during those same intensities. So it's going to artificially kind of say, oh, you can exercise at this really high heart rate. Like your zone 4 is actually your zone 2. So there's that caveat of like, I'm like, well, if you're a beginner and you have low aerobic fitness, let's start with your heart rate, but let's not freak out about it being perfect all the time. Let's start at that percent of your heart rate. Then from there, as you gain more fitness, or if you are someone who's transitioning, okay, you've been doing this, you've been gaining momentum, maybe then you're like, hey, I can do an hour of cardio. That's usually the point. I mean, we do have it for some of my things where I'll offer like a 30-minute threshold test, but I think like they're not as good until you can get like to an hour of sustained cardio. If you can handle an hour of sustained cardio or an hour long run or whatever that is, that's about that point where you're going to actually test your threshold. And so that's where I'm like, okay, your data is probably going to be a little bit more personalized and accurate to you if we can figure out what it is relative to your own fitness and your own heart rate and your own response. But otherwise, if you don't want to do that or test all this, what you can do is just start saying, okay, let me run, cycle, exercise, cardio at a point of which I'm not breathing super rapidly. You will have increased respiration. Can you carry a conversation? One of the things that I love to do on my runs when I get bored, or if I'm just running and my mom or brother calls me, is I answer and I talk to them and carry conversations with them while I'm running. I love it because it kills time for my run. But sometimes my mom doesn't even notice that I'm running until she'll hear like cars or whatever. And she'll be like, are you running? And I'm like, yeah, but I can carry that conversation while running. And that's how I know I am in my zone 2. You can tell when you're lying to yourself. I do it all the time too. I'm no different than you guys. And I'm like, oh, I'm totally in my zone 2. I'm absolutely not in my zone 2, but I'm in a hurry that day and it's okay. But can you sing? Can you talk in like not just fragments, but like in maybe 15, 20, 30 word long sentences without having to like gasp after you do it? Can you actually just like speak? Does your body feel like it has enough oxygen, not only to keep propelling you forward, but like carry that conversation at the same time? A great way I know that I'm in zone 2 or versus like higher intensities is like, how much focus is your training required? Like if you have increased focus, you're probably at an increased intensity. That's why, fun fact, your lifting that's repetitive would be more interesting if you just did it more intensely. That intensity brings in interest. That's one of my favorite things to say. But is your aura around you feel blue, light? You can look at things, read things, you're aware of things around you, you're kind of lost in thought. When you're doing more intense exercise, you're having to focus more on your steps and your breathing and what you're doing. So these are just all things that I like to use for checking in with yourself. And so you can also use RPE. And so an RPE for like zone 2 is going to be like an RP of like 3, 4, maybe 5, just depending on that. And I think a lot of people are exercising at a 5, 6, 7 and calling it zone 2. So these are all different ways that you can assess this. And I like taking a holistic approach to this of like, okay, how hard am I actually training today? And it's a great way to check into yourself too, because sometimes like my heart rate will still be pretty low, but I'll feel like hot garbage on my runs. And I'm like, I'm just going to slow down because I feel terrible, even though my heart rate data says that I'm fine, kind of thing. And so that's why I like these holistic approaches to things. Or sometimes my heart rate's high, but I doesn't feel that hard to me. And I'm like, oh, well, I forgot my chest strap and I'm using a wrist-based monitor. So that's probably why it's not as accurate today. I'm going to use exertion and talk a little bit more to make sure that I'm at this point of which I want to be. So there's a bunch of different ways to assess this, but that's my approach. Like if you're somebody who's transitioning from getting, okay, I'm not just a total noob, Alyssa, what should I do? It's like, okay, let's use these parameters and then let's think about your training distribution across the week. So I like telling people start with all of your training is easy except for one day. And then as your training volume increases, all of your training is easy except for 2 days. Or you have like 2 sessions across the week where you finish hard or something like that instead. Like you're taking some of those minutes per week and making them a little bit harder while you're really working on developing this. Because I think a lot of people think that they can't do metcons or HIIT workouts or harder intensity stuff while developing that. Well, let's make most of your sessions or most of the minutes per week that you're doing this to develop this while you're focusing on developing this more skewed towards that zone 2 and maybe 1, maybe 2 higher hard intensity quality sessions per week. Because remember, this is driven by volume. So if you only have a limited amount of time per week, you're just going to shift and skew that percentage for that, or you're going to have to increase more time, which you can build up more time too while you're doing this. Or then later, if you want to, shift back more, maybe you're doing the same amount of minutes per week, but you've really worked in that zone 2. You feel like your aerobic base is there. You're recovering better during training. You have this higher cardio fitness. You can tell your heart rate's dropping. Then you're like, okay, I'm going to bring in 2 quality sessions a week and trade off that other one right now because I'm going to go back to focusing on that. It doesn't need to be this dogmatic, like you only do 80% of your training for life. It depends on what your total volume, the characteristics you're training. But I really like we do aerobic base build seasons with our running programs. And I have just 1 speed workout a week, and it's optional if people want to do it, because you do still want to preserve those characteristics of high hard intensity training. They are important, but you do need that. The thing with zone 2 is you need volume, but the reason that you can do so much volume with zone 2 is it's recoverable and it's easy. So if you actually do it where it's actually easy and it is actually recoverable, you can kind of do a lot of it and it doesn't interfere with your lifting or your recovery or your other aspects of training. Versus like if you're doing zone 4 for like 5 runs a week, you're probably going to feel like garbage and your lifts are going to be impacted, or you're going to feel terrible if you're only doing 4 to 5 metcons a week or 4 to 5 orange theory classes or F45s or whatever that is, and you're not doing a little bit of that easy stuff too. And then you're going and doing a run and you're like, well, why is my heart rate high? I'm fit. Well, you need to take time to distribute your volume towards that to actually train that over time. So that's like the tough love that you have to give people. I'm like, yeah, your metcons are great, but you're not recovering during the interval runs, during your workouts or the cycling or the rowing, because you need that aerobic fitness, because usually that's the recovery period for a lot of people during those workouts. And they're not. They're redlining that kind of stuff because they haven't developed this, or they're doing HIIT workouts, or they're lifting in the gym and they're not recovering between intervals or sets because they just don't have this fitness characteristic trained. And if you're realizing that you're lacking that, investing time where you just distribute your volume more towards that, you can still do, you don't have to give up CrossFit or your HIIT or your any of that, but just start shifting more of that per week towards that. And a lot of people want to know what's the amount that I need to do? And I'm like, well, more is always better, but you don't always have that much time, which is why I'm saying shift your volume that you are doing to prioritize that, or increase it and build it up. The physical activity guidelines, it's like 150 to 300 plus minute per week. You get more benefits the more you do, but not everyone has time to do that. But if you have the time to invest in like a good aerobic base building season where you can really do that and you can do more high volume and you have the time for that, then spend that time doing it. It's not worthless if you can't sustain that forever. If you have that, you might pull back. Maybe you lift 5 days a week and you're going to shift to 3 so you can do more of that cardio. That's when we start thinking about your whole program holistically, and you should do that as well, especially when we're thinking about having balanced fitness training and like these developing all these characteristics that we need for life and health and longevity. So there's my high horse.
I love your high horses. I think the thing that is going to be a departure for a lot of people is not just in understanding the physiology and why having that base is going to benefit them even at those higher intensities. It's the mindset of, especially I would say with the cardio aspect, where it's like we just are used to going hard, going hard, going hard. And it's almost an inversion of what we see that a lot of people need, right? Some people would approach it where they're going, let's say they're doing 5 sessions a week, they're going to go hard for 4 and maybe easy for 1. And that is like such a mental departure for so many people, where they feel like the self-talk, I'm being lazy, I'm not working hard enough, is, I think, really going to become the sticking point. Mm-hmm. Any advice for those people who are like, I don't know, it all sounds good, but I feel like I'm just not working hard enough?
I really think it's important to lean into like, why do you have to do all of your training hard every single day? And why do you feel like it's not working unless you're doing it hard? Because also, like, zone 2 isn't, I think I made a post on this, like zone 2 or easier or submaximal training isn't easy. It is hard. Like, it is hard. Like, think about it. Every one of you complains so much about how zone 2 is so impossible, but then you're like, it's not hard enough. And I'm like, but it is hard to do. Doing an hour-long zone 2 workout for somebody who doesn't mentally lean into that focus or that boredom is going to be hard in its own indifferent way. But not all training needs to be hard to be quality. And what I think a lot of people are missing is that they think that their training is quality because it's all hard all the time. But what you're doing is you're just having a lot of the same. And so you're not getting the max of your best efforts on those hardest days. Rather, you're just kind of getting a lot of the same. And so, if you really struggle with that, I really want you to think about like why you wouldn't polarize your cardio just like you do your lifting. We don't do our lifting at RPE 10 every single day of the week. We do RPE 7 or 8, and sometimes we max out and sometimes we go really hard, or we'll do a top set and back off sets. It's no different with your training. We don't need to go all out. It's the quality, but it's also the stimulus that's giving you the characteristics that you want. If you don't want to do zone 2, don't do it. You're an adult with autonomy. That's my biggest thing for people. It's like, don't do it. Don't do it. I'm not making you do it. I'm just giving you the information. But if you're frustrated that certain things aren't happening for you in your training, then you have to have that top flood with yourself. We were like, well, maybe I don't need all this intensity all the time. And what I would really encourage people to do is lean into doing this easy stuff and see how much better your higher intensity days actually go, how much maybe your intervals, or like how many calories you're burning on the rower in your intervals or your air bike or your pace or your effort or your mileage intensity is when you have that recoverable contrast in your training, and you're, everything's getting better moving forward because you can pull back so you can move forward in other stuff. So think about that too. It's like, don't think about intensity as every single session on its own, but look at it across your week. Where are you able to go harder because you're pulling back to go easier? That's where I would look at that holistically rather than just in the moment, and get over this idea that you need to annihilate yourself for fitness to count. You just got to get over that. And that's hard. That's me being kind of like tough lovey, where I'm like, just be disciplined, blah, blah, blah. And I don't mean it in that kind of way, but like really try. That's hard in its own way. Just because it's physiologically not hard doesn't mean it's not difficult. And honestly, once you lean into zone 2, I freaking love zone 2 training. It's so great because you can turn your mind off. It's passive. It's easy. You can do emails during it. You can, talk to friends, make it a community thing if you need to do that. Like watch TV, watch, your favorite show while you're doing it. That's a great behavior change thing, is to stack a podcast or a show that you like with the thing that you don't love to do to make it easier. Call somebody. I just said, I talked to my mom and brother. My mom like makes fun of me. She's like, you don't have time to talk to me unless you're on a run. And I was like, you call me while I'm on a run, you get me for an hour, a whole hour. I'll talk to you about whatever you want, kind of thing. And so, I think leaning into having a different mental approach and view of what training is and intensity, and what quality training is, and why that is defined as intensity only to you all of the time. Because odds are, if you're doing all of your training at high intensity all the time, and that's that fine line between people, because it's like, well, you do want intensity in your training. I don't want to act like you don't. It is hard. but you do want to have that contrast as well. Our bodies respond to those different stimuluses differently. And so you have to ask yourself, do I want to feel like it's hard or do I want it to work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Love that. Tough love and tough love. Welcome. It's funny because I was out back visiting my family, looking for pierogies, of course. And
Yes.
when I was out running, I took a picture of myself where I was like talking to the camera and somebody said, how do you always look so happy when you're out on a run? And I was like, cause I do a lot of my running is in zone 2. And I'm literally like, wow, look at these flowers blooming in the neighborhood. And like, oh, there's that lady down the street with her dog. And, you get to kind of not be in the fucking pain cave all the time, to be quite frank.
Yeah.
I mean, there's something nice about going into the pain cave, but if you're there all the time, it's not a nice place to be. And I would say too, for my community tending to be 40s, 50s and up, just like you've got to give your body a chance to recover. And if you want to do that intensity, like intense all the time, you best be fueling for it. And that's, again, I think where some of that stuff is falling down for folks. So, if you're always injured all the time, if you're kind of crispy around the edges, it's like, I know it's hard, but you got to learn new things. And why not set that as a challenge for yourself? If you want a challenge, like the challenge is to learn how to train in a different way.
Yeah. And it's recoverable. I hate advertising it as this, but it is very true. And maybe people buy into more. It's a recoverable way to do more because everyone's obsessed with doing more. Well, that's a great way to do more and not really have it be super detrimental to your body. Like if you want to do more, do really easy cardio within reason. Like don't add 10 hours a week, but yeah, it's a great point. That crispy around the edges, that feeling like you're filled with battery acid and fragile all the time kind of thing. And you're not recovering. Or a lot of people are like, I can't balance doing cardio and resistance training. I can't handle both of my same training programs. Well, let me introduce you to zone 2, my friends, because it makes it so much easier. So that way, and I think especially your community, there's a lot out there where it's like, yeah, you do need some high hard intensity stuff and sprint interval training, but also a lot of the things that lead to greater risk factors in that 40 plus transition are poor cardiovascular fitness and health. And like, how do we preserve that? Well, we train the things that we know that we need. And some of that even helps with some of the symptomology that we see with that because of the vascular benefits and development. And, you're quite literally stressing and straining your vascular system to handle heat and heat dissipation better. And it might actually improve some of those symptoms that come with that. So, don't write it off.
Yeah. We were talking about on our walk last night, because now we're those people that walk at night, where 10 years ago we weren't. So my husband and I were talking about how our strength has changed over the last, say, 10, 15 years. And our focus is different in training now, where I'm real interested in being a Swiss Army knife. I want to be fairly okay at different things. And we were talking about last night on this walk, how now we're in our mid 40s and having better cardiovascular fitness while we're now kind of both taking some time to build more of a base could be taking away from, say, top end strength. It is well worth it in terms of the health aspect as well for us being in our mid 40s and just thinking about things like cardiovascular health and for women seeing that men as well, but for women seeing those cardiovascular risks rise in our age group and higher, and how, sometimes we're just going to make trade-offs. But yeah, I love that you brought that up. That's so important.
No, I like the Swiss Army knife approach. And that's like the hybrid thing. I'm like, hybrid training is health. And it doesn't have to be running and lifting. It can be so many different things, but train multiple characteristics of your fitness. Like if I take anything from the CrossFit model, then there's definitely bits and pieces that I really like about that CrossFit model of things. And it's let's train multiple characteristics of our fitness because that makes us well-rounded athletes. That makes us healthier. We want to be aerobically trained and strong and powerful and able to handle our body weight and move. Like these are all things that are important, especially as we are aging and getting older. Like you're gonna have to pick yourself off at the floor and get up and down from things and pick things up and move them around. And you want to be able to have some pep in your step still. And you want to have aerobic training, but you want to be strong and strengthen your bones and your muscles. And we do that by having more, honestly, athletic approach programs. And it ties back to everything we talked about in the beginning, especially I know your audience is largely females. You don't need different things. They just become more important, or they've always been important and you neglected them. You need good, well-rounded training that is polarized, periodized, and contains multiple components of fitness. So that way you can be the most resilient human that you can be from puberty through periods and pregnancy and menopause and beyond. So there we tied it all in. Look, the circle comes together at the end.
It does. It comes full circle. Oh, this has been, I mean, we could keep talking, but I know you've got things to do.
I know.
But this has been awesome. And I'm so glad that we were finally able to have this conversation. There's so many more things I want to chat with you about, but maybe we'll do a part 2 someday. So we save some things for then, but tell the good listeners where they can follow you, learn more about everything that you offer, and just kind of get involved in your world so they have a nice contextual, science-informed, practical counterpoint to a lot of the things that they're seeing out in the world.
Well, if you like black and white absolutism in fitness, don't follow me, because I'm going to make you think. I'm going to challenge your thoughts. I'm going to make you give you nuance. But anyway, all jokes aside, you can follow me at Lyss Fitness. And so that's where I mainly hang out on Instagram, but my YouTube, which is growing and I have a lot of really good content on there, is Lyss Fitness. And then my podcast is called The Messy Middle, because I live in the messy middle of fitness and that nuance and all that stuff. And so, you can also find like all of my training programs, services, ebooks, either through Instagram or doclessfitness.com. And so we'll hopefully be coming out with cardio only subscriptions to my training programs next year for my non-runners, because we know that that's in high demand, and who better than my team filled with exercise physiologists to put that together for you. A bunch of meathead, grunthead, cardio lift. My whole team is like lifter turned cardio hybrid junkies. And I love it, because we're just like a bunch of bros, quote unquote bros who got into the cardio world. And so it's a lot of fun. And so, I have a ton on cardio and the female phys stuff and lifting too, because at the end of the day, female physiology needs are cardio and strength. So I think it all is cyclical. Sometimes I think people think that I don't talk about the female phys stuff enough. And I'm like, no, everything I'm talking about every single day applies to this population. Like debunking cycle training isn't what you need every single day. You need actual good training approaches and applications. So I would definitely dive in. I have a few long form videos or podcasts on like cyclical training and my actual advice for that, and like prescription for that. Hopefully more on menopause stuff as I dive more into this field with my postdoc. And then I have a ton of the cardio stuff, like I said, either out or coming, especially on zones if you want to learn more. So Lyss Fitness across the board. You can find everything. Probably just start from Instagram or my website and go out.
Fantastic. We'll link all that up in the show notes. Thank you so much
for
being with us. I can't wait to share this episode out. It's going to be great. And I think this is the exact, perspective that people need. It's always nice to also hear people who are sharing similar thoughts. Because I think people need that counterpoint to some of, like you said, the absolutisms that are out there. So the more people that they can hear talking about the nuance, the context and all that stuff, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.